Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Is the concern over China's economic, political, and military rise overwrought? The U.S. economy is forecast to exceed China's growth rate this year for the first time since 1976, and there are other indicators of China faltering. Joining us to discuss is Craig Singleton. He is the senior fellow at the Federation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
I guess first give us your sort of general assessment of the state of China right now at present time.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's a particular narrative out there that China is on the rise, and it's one that the Chinese Communist Party has been very keen to amplify, and it's one that for many years corresponded to every sort of quantifiable metric out there about China. Its military continues to grow. If you were to look at economic statistics throughout the 2000s, you would say, wow, this is an economic juggernaut. China is everywhere and doing everything. And so I think that we have to sort of sit back and recognize that, the last 2 years throughout the pandemic, it sort of feels like the world has been on pause or on hold. A lot has been happening. And China's economy, which had already been slowing before the pandemic, finds itself in free fall right now. And that economic decline sort of poses some pretty serious ramifications for the Chinese Communist Party and its power projection.
Yeah, so is this directly attributable to China's zero COVID policy, or does it go deeper than that?
Well, I think we've been seeing a general slowing in China's economy for several years, and that was always forecast. And the Chinese Communist Party was very keen to control that sort of economic slowdown and to build a sustainable domestic consumption proposition within China. The idea being that Chinese people buying Chinese things and reducing China's reliance on exports. What we're seeing right now, though, to your point, is a real acceleration in that slowdown. So much so that senior members of the Chinese Communist Party are starting to sound the alarm about what it could mean for the party, its legitimacy, China's future. And I think much of that can really be attributed to Xi Jinping's zero COVID policies, which have been very draconian and really driven a little bit more by ideological considerations than science and maybe what the technocrats inside Beijing are thinking.
Yeah, maybe just for our audience, making sure they understand, what is China's zero COVID policy? How does that work?
Sure. So the prism through which Beijing typically views COVID is the notion that China can do it better, that China's system is more efficient, and that they've sort of watched with alarm as the United States and Western European countries and Canada had these mass lockdowns and big contractions in their economy. And the Chinese said, well, we don't think we need to go through some of those steps, and we sort of think that we can contain it in radically different ways. The Chinese have refused to embrace mRNA vaccines like Canada, the United States, and the rest of the Western sort of world. And they were sort of holding on to this idea that they could just keep China outside of its borders. But the highly transmissible Omicron variant sort of was the game changer for them. And as a result, large portions of China and Chinese industry have been locked down for months. Nothing's coming in and nothing's coming out. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that the Chinese vaccine, the one that was domestically developed, is by no means as effective as the Western vaccine. But the Chinese Communist Party can't accept the Pfizer and Moderna and the Western vaccines, right? Because that would be tacit admission that its vaccine development program was not as strong and that its vaccine is not as good. And so it's that ideological hold that really has sort of debilitated China. And while the rest of the world is slowly coming out of the pandemic and we see travel restrictions limited and strong booster campaigns, it's the exact opposite in China right now because they can't seem to sort of embrace the notion that their approach maybe was ineffective, inefficient, but also the notion that to do so would be to acknowledge that the West did it better. And that sort of goes against the philosophy there.
Right. So they kind of put all their poker chips on one bet, and they have done a good job, as far as we know, of reducing deaths. But the cost, the economic cost, and the psychological cost has been large.
It's been quite severe. I mean, we're talking about lockdowns, nothing like we experienced in the Western world where you had to stay home for a week. People in major Chinese cities like Beijing, Shanghai, were stuck in their apartments for more than 120 days.
You're with Boom and Bust here. Craig, I had to cut you off there. Please continue your thoughts on the zero COVID policy there.
No, I would just add and sort of conclude to say that the Chinese still aren't out of zero COVID, and zero COVID is unlikely to go away anytime soon. This fall, Xi Jinping is all but set during the 20th Party Congress to assume what is a once unthinkable third term as party secretary. And one of the reasons that you won't see a relaxation of zero COVID is because they are fairly petrified that hospitals would be overrun. You mentioned death counts. Death rates could increase significantly through the spread of this disease. You don't have an inoculated population. You don't have a lot of the social infrastructure that you have sort of in Canada and the United States and Western Europe to sort of maintain stability and to sort of maintain all of this cohesion during this sort of very difficult time. That's not going to go away anytime soon, unfortunately. So China will find itself going through rolling lockdowns, and the pressure and the constraints that will face on Chinese leaders and China's economy will be felt here in the Western world pretty acutely.
Let's broaden out for a second. Talk about Chinese leader Xi Jinping's planning and economic choices over the last few years as well, because COVID has had a huge impact, but it's not just about that, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, we have sort of seen all of the indications for years now that Xi Jinping was very intrigued and interested in deepening the party's role in the economy, a strong shift away from that market liberalization that was very closely affiliated and aligned with China's rapid economic growth. And there is a strong notion that the growth drivers that China has enjoyed for several decades are really running on fumes.
Right.
And so Xi Jinping's entire strategy is based upon the notion that they're going to build up China's middle class and having Chinese citizens buying a lot more of the things that are produced in China. And right now, actually, what we're seeing is the opposite. Chinese consumer sentiment and spending is way down. You're starting to see a rapid increase in unemployment, which is a real concern for the Chinese Communist Party. And so what we really thought could be a moment where Xi Jinping would push deeper into his sort of reform effort, use the crisis as an opportunity. What we've in fact seen is the opposite, a pullback, a decision to return to a lot of the policies, many of which kind of created an unstable economic environment in China, like its housing boom. We've seen a pullback to reinforce those policies. And it's just interesting to sort of see that develop because Xi Jinping spent years railing against those very same policies that he's now embracing.
And, you've written about how, when there's a large economic growth happening in China, there's a little bit for everybody or most everybody. But now you've written about a really internal competition for increasingly, for fewer resources, let's put it that way. Is that something that you're noticing as well?
I think it's just a reality. I mean, it's fascinating to speak with folks who are in China, sort of experiencing this both in the private sector, but also just the average citizen. They live most of their life, at least through a period of rapid economic growth, like a land of opportunity, tremendous amounts of capital and foreign direct investment. There was no shortage of potential. And that large economic growth helped fund China's Belt and Road Initiative, its power projection, key facets of its society. But now there will be less money capable of being spent. And so you're going to see fissures and fraction and tension between all the various domestic stakeholders in China to get a smaller piece of that pie. And that is a dynamic that has not really existed, not in this way in China in a very long time. And so we're sort of entering some uncharted waters.
And you've also written about how Xi's plans for what he calls common prosperity have been ditched. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So about 2.5 years ago, we started to hear this phrase common prosperity in a lot of Xi's speeches. Oh, sorry about that. And the notion was that the Chinese were going to drive income inequality and really build up that middle class. They were really going to ensure that the wealth and the resources were spread out. And part of the goal was to, once again, bolster that middle class. They're buying things, reducing economic reliance on the West and the United States. But a lot of those reforms were met with derision from China's private sector and foreign investors who saw deepened party influence in the market, in private business, and in society writ large. A lot of that talk about common prosperity has sort of disappeared from the front pages of newspapers. It's not there anymore.
We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Craig, please continue your thought from before the break.
No, absolutely. So in the last few years, we have seen this massive tech crackdown by the Chinese Communist Party. They've always viewed the growing power of tech firms and tech companies as a threat to the party. They were sort of operating independently from the party and willing to sort of push and press the party in ways that the party was frankly uncomfortable with. And so for the last few years, we have seen a serious crackdown in their ability to get to launch IPO, to sort of build out their base, to get involved in multiple platforms at once. And we did see the installation of Chinese Communist Party officials into the corporate structure in both Chinese tech companies and other companies. But what we're seeing now, in fact, and I would say that all of those Chinese Communist Party policies cratered the tech industry. You saw massive layoffs, loss of valuations, sort of foreign investors fleeing, sort of seeing that this was not an opportunity space for them anymore. But now, because of China's growing economic problems and the rapid economic cool down, the Chinese Communist Party understands that they actually need big tech. Big tech is a big employer throughout the country. And so at a time when the Chinese Communist Party is sort of facing very serious unemployment figures. Approximately 1 in 5 people between the ages of 16 and 24 is currently unemployed.
Wow.
Exactly, as millions more, about 16 million Chinese students graduate from college this month, and many of them will not have jobs. So that number is only going to increase. They are sort of placing bets on Chinese tech to say, please hire these new grads.
Right.
Please. So.
Wow, that's an incredible statistic. There seems to be a bit of a political tug of war. I mean, it's hard to tell in China, of course, because it's so opaque, but between Xi and his premier. So maybe tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Sure. I mean, there's always been a little bit of a tension there. And I think what we're seeing is that sort of breakdown between the technocrats, like the current premier and a lot of the other technocrats who sort of oversaw China's rapid economic growth, and the ideologues like Xi, who have been pushing just a very different vision for China, more state control. And this crisis opportunity, largely brought about by Xi's zero COVID strategy, has really exposed like some of those divisions. Xi, publicly says, we have this covered. Don't publicly doubt our zero COVID strategy. Those that do, will face uncertain consequences. But then you have the premier and others out here talking about the potential for, quote, economic ruin. You can't think of a more divergent sort of messaging. And what we are thinking and seeing, from all of these signals is a fractured policy environment. And it's very reminiscent of what we saw during the end of the Mao Zedong era. In that case, the technocrats won, and you had a push towards policy by consensus in a real several decades where the technocrats were in power. It's unclear how this will sort of shake out, but the economic situation is sure to weaken Xi's domestic political position.
So how should your analysis, and I know you're not the only one looking at it this way, but you're certainly advancing that point of view, how should that change the way the U.S. and its allies engage with China?
Well, I think one thing that we have to do is sort of step back and say, are all of our strategies as they relate to China and great power competition and sort of a competition for influence around the world, are we basing a lot of our assumptions and planning around data from 2016, like we mentioned, a time when when China's economy was going up, 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 where everything sort of looked like China was going to take over the world. And we do sort of need to step back and ask ourselves, are we placing the right bets in the Western world? Do we need to compete fiercely with China in every domain? To give a great example, does the United States or Canada or Europe need to build a road in a part of Africa, or can the Chinese pay for it? And I say that because the United States can run a truck over that road just as well as the Chinese. Did we have to pay for it? But maybe there are certain things like ports in strategic locations or areas where we assess the Chinese may establish a military presence where Western countries say that is an area where we sort of want to get involved and where we need to have, in our diminished economic resource environment in the West with high inflation and sort of economic turbulence, we need to be smarter about how we place these bets. And I think the key issue that we sort of have to ask ourselves a little bit is, what's the role of Western prosperity in sort of advancing this agenda? And there's a strong push by lots of Western countries to have a strong democracy agenda. And I work at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I get it. But I do think we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to promote trade? What are we doing to promote economic prosperity and to increase the advantages?
We're going to take another break and we'll be back with our guest after that. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Craig Singleton. He is a senior China fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, talking all things China here. Craig, again, looking at it from a geopolitical perspective as well as an economic perspective, what does your analysis mean for the future of Taiwan and also the competition in the South China Sea?
Sure. I actually think that predictions about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan are way off. I don't think an invasion is imminent anytime soon, and a lot of that I think is driven by the fact that the Chinese are not going to launch a war that they could lose. The Chinese, I think, are watching very closely what's happening in Ukraine. They are probably, we've written that, Putin's invasion is Xi's worst nightmare. This idea of a long, protracted, bloody, highly contentious environment is not what the Chinese sort of want. And the Chinese actually haven't said we will take back Taiwan by a particular date. I think the greatest likelihood is that perhaps the Taiwanese in a crisis scenario were to push for independence, and that could sort of be a triggering event in the region and sort of force China into war. But I do think that China's current economic slowdown sort of forces them to rethink some of their assumptions about a potential reunification by force. They understand right now that if they did do something like that, the Western world would most likely be able to respond with unprecedented sanctions against the Chinese. And they may have been able to absorb those sorts of costs when GDP was at 8 or 9%. You could take a 6% cut and still be okay, right? But now if you have a GDP that's hovering around 3%, and that's pretty generous, I would say, the Chinese Communist Party it would seem as if they would rethink a lot of those assumptions and whether they could absorb the costs. So I think all in all, what we're seeing is actually a reduced likelihood of any sort of military altercation, at the same time that the Chinese will continue to invest in their military and they will continue to coerce the Taiwanese. But I wouldn't predict or assess right now that we're anywhere near sort of imminent invasion or reunification.
I guess one of the downsides of Xi's worsening position, though, is that competition or jingoistic behavior could be more likely as he tries to shore up his position. Are you concerned about that?
It's possible, but I think what we're starting to see a little bit is that there are so many competing crises right now inside of China. And if China is going to sort of make a move by choice, they're going to want to do that from a position of strength. And right now, there's fairly broad recognition that there is a closing gap, but still a fairly significant gap between China's military capabilities and those of the United States and its partners. China's economy is not in a particularly great position. They're also dealing, obviously, in China with the COVID scenario. All of these sort of self-reinforcing crises sort of lend itself to thinking that the Chinese will exercise a little patience, and they have for decades, and they will make that reunification move at a time and place of perhaps they're choosing, but they're certainly going to do it from a position of strength if they can. I think it's incumbent upon the United States and other countries to ensure that we don't give the Chinese any sort of excuse to make a move. And we just have to be really diligent in how we help Taiwan bolster their defenses and what partners do in the region to make sure that we defend our interests, but we need not be provocative.
Yeah, do you think, we've got about a minute left, do you think that the U.S. allies in the region are acting in the interests of the whole, or are they trying to cut deals with China still? What's your assessment of things?
I think there's a real growing assessment, particularly in Europe, that the Chinese and Chinese belligerence in general is a major problem that needs to be contended with. I think that you're starting to see a very strong outgrowth in what I would consider like the classic trilateral relationship between the United States, Japan, and Australia when it comes to defense, and even more so with the Quad, with adding India to the mix. Although I would assess that that partnership will never reach the level, nor should it, of a, for example, Asian NATO. But we are seeing this renewed emphasis on the Indo-Pacific and what it means, and the importance of economic opportunities and free and fair elections throughout the region. And I just get the sense that even despite Ukraine, we're going to see this shift in importance in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years.
Craig Singleton, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. Thanks for your insights.
Yep, thank you.
Interesting insights from Craig Singleton of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. A lot to ponder there. It's been an article of faith that China is rising, rising, rising. Maybe there are some warning signs there that we have to recalibrate. Thanks for watching today.